All right, so get ready because today we're diving deep into the American Revolution, but not just the battles and dates you might already know. We're going to explore how Enlightenment ideas, those radical notions of reason and individual rights, actually fueled the flames of rebellion. We'll uncover some surprising connections, like how a hefty tax on tea helped birth a nation, and the unexpected role of a gruesome invention, the guillotine, in a revolution supposedly based on reason. To help us navigate through all of this, we have an expert who is a master at connecting those seemingly unrelated dots and revealing the bigger picture. You know what's fascinating me is that the American Revolution didn't just erupt out of nowhere, right? There's this whole backstory involving the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. Can you set the stage for us?
Absolutely. So the French and Indian War, which raged from 1756 to 1763, was basically a struggle for control over territories in North America. The British ultimately won, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. They emerged from the conflict with a mountain of debt and a need to replenish their coffers. That's when they turned their attention to the American colonies, who had participated in the war effort, and decided to impose taxes. But not just any taxes. These were taxes specifically designed to make the colonies pay for their own defense, which the colonists found deeply unfair.
Wow. So a war between Britain and France, half a world away, ended up setting the stage for a revolution in America. That's quite a ripple effect. It makes you wonder if the British had foreseen the consequences. Would they have approached things differently?
That's a great question, and one historians still debate. But what we do know is that the British, burdened by war debt, chose to impose taxes that the colonists viewed as unjust. One particularly controversial levy was the Stamp Act of 1765. It required colonists to pay a tax on all sorts of documents, newspapers, legal papers, even playing cards. Imagine having to pay extra just to enjoy a game of cards or read your morning news. Then came the Townshend Acts of 1767, which placed taxes on everyday items like glass, paint, and of course, tea.
It's funny how taxes, even centuries later, still managed to stir up strong emotions. I can only imagine the frustration the colonists must have felt, especially considering they had no elected representatives in the British Parliament. They were being taxed without having a say in the matter. That's where the iconic phrase, no taxation without representation, comes into play right now.
Precisely. The simple yet powerful phrase encapsulated the colonists' core grievance. They were being denied their rights as British subjects, to have a voice in the decisions that directly impacted their lives. It became a rallying cry for colonial resistance, which manifested in boycotts of British goods, fiery protests, and the formation of groups like the Sons of Liberty, known for their more spirited methods of resistance.
Now, when we talk about colonial resistance, we can't forget the Boston Tea Party. It's such a vivid image in American history. Colonists disguised as Native Americans,
Right.
tossing chests of tea into Boston Harbor in defiance of the tea tax. What's interesting is that this wasn't just a random act of vandalism. It was a calculated political statement, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. The Boston Tea Party in 1773 was a turning point. It was a bold act of defiance against British authority, a symbolic rejection of the taxes imposed upon them. The British responded with a series of harsh measures, known as the Intolerable Acts, aimed at punishing Massachusetts and quelling dissent. But these acts had the opposite effect. Instead of subduing the colonists, they only fueled the flames of rebellion.
So we have a war that sets the stage, a series of taxes that spark outrage, and a defiant act of protest that raises the stakes. Feels like we're on the verge of a full-blown revolution. And it's around this time that we see the ideas of the Enlightenment, those revolutionary concepts, from thinkers like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Montesquieu, start to take root in the colonies, right?
Exactly. These Enlightenment thinkers were challenging traditional notions of power and advocating for individual rights, limited government, and the separation of powers. Their ideas were like wildfire, spreading across Europe and reaching the shores of America. And they would have a profound impact on the course of the American Revolution. In fact, you can argue that the American Revolution wasn't just a political revolution, it was a philosophical one as well.
I've always been curious about how specific Enlightenment ideas were put into action during the Revolution. Was there a particular pamphlet or speech that resonated with the colonists? A moment when these abstract ideas were translated into concrete action?
There were actually several key moments. Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, published in 1776, was incredibly influential. It presented a powerful argument for independence in plain language that resonated with ordinary colonists. Paine drew heavily from Locke's ideas of natural rights and social contract theory, arguing that it was the colonists' right and duty to overthrow a tyrannical government
That's interesting. So these ideas weren't just confined to intellectual circles. They were being debated in pubs and coffee houses across the colonies. It was a true battle of ideas, wasn't it?
It absolutely was. And as the colonists grappled with these ideas and debated their future, they moved closer to a decisive break with Great Britain. In 1774, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. Their goal was to present a united front and formally express their grievances to King George III. They drafted a list of complaints, asserting their rights as British subjects and calling for the repeal of the oppressive acts. However, their appeals fell on deaf ears, and tensions continued to escalate.
So despite their attempts at diplomacy, the path to revolution became increasingly inevitable. It's almost as if each event, each decision, was pushing them closer to that breaking point.
That's a great way to put it. And as the situation deteriorated, the colonists increasingly turned to the ideals of the Enlightenment to justify their cause. They began to see themselves not just as disgruntled British subjects, but as individuals with inherent rights deserving of self-government.
It sounds like we're about to witness the birth of a nation,
Yeah.
fueled by a potent mix of political grievances and philosophical ideals. And I have a feeling the Declaration of Independence is going to be our next stop on this journey.
You're absolutely right. The Declaration of Independence, adopted on July 4th, 1776, was more than just a list of grievances. It was a bold proclamation of a new vision for America, a vision rooted in Enlightenment ideals. Thomas Jefferson, the principal author, drew heavily from the works of John Locke and his concept of natural rights. Locke argued that all individuals are born with inherent rights to life, liberty, and property. Jefferson, echoing Locke's ideas, declared these rights to be unalienable, meaning they cannot be taken away or infringed upon by any government. He famously wrote that all men are created equal and endowed with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He famously wrote that all men are created equal and endowed with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
It's fascinating how those words penned over 2 centuries ago are still debated today. They've become such a cornerstone of American identity, but also a source of ongoing discussion about their interpretation and application. Did Jefferson ever imagine they would spark such enduring debate?
It's impossible to know for sure, but the Declaration certainly sparked a firestorm of debate right from the start. And it went even further than just proclaiming individual rights. It challenged the very foundation of anarchical rule by asserting the principle of popular sovereignty, the idea that all government power ultimately derives from the consent of the governed. This concept, championed by Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau, struck at the heart of the British monarchy's authority.
So the Declaration wasn't just a breakup letter to King George III. It was a revolutionary manifesto, declaring the right to rebel against unjust governments and establishing a new basis for authority, the will of the people. It must have sent shockwaves through the halls of power in Europe.
It did indeed, and this bold declaration, backed by the force of arms, set the stage for a long and arduous war for independence. The American colonists faced overwhelming odds, but were determined to fight for their newfound freedom. And after years of struggle, they ultimately emerged victorious. However, the journey from revolution to a stable nation was far from smooth.
Declaring independence is one thing, but actually governing a newly formed nation is another challenge altogether. What happened after the revolution? How did the colonists go about building a new government from scratch?
That's where it gets really interesting. Their first attempt at a government under the Articles of Confederation proved to be too weak and ineffective. One of the most glaring weaknesses was the inability of the central government to effectively regulate commerce between the states. Imagine trying to establish a stable economy when each state is essentially operating like its own independent country, with its own currencies and trade barriers. It created chaos and hindered economic growth.
So it sounds like they went from one extreme, a powerful monarchy, to the other, a government so decentralized that it couldn't function effectively. Did the colonists realize this weakness at the time? Or did it take a crisis for them to see the need for a stronger national government?
It became increasingly apparent that the Articles of Confederation were not up to the task of governing a growing nation. Economic instability, interstate conflicts, and the inability to effectively address national issues led to calls for reform. And this is where we see the genius of the United States Constitution come into play. Drafted in 1787 and ratified in 1789, the Constitution aimed to address these weaknesses and create more stable and effective government.
Okay, so walk me through this. How did the Constitution actually solve the problem of a weak central government? What were the key changes they made?
Well, for starters, the Constitution established a federal system. That divided power between the national government and the states. It gave the federal government the power to regulate interstate commerce, coin money, establish a national military, and conduct foreign policy. All things the Articles of Confederation had failed to do effectively. It also incorporated a system of checks and balances, with three branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial, each with its own distinct powers and responsibilities.
So they were essentially putting Enlightenment ideas into practice. Montesquieu's concept of separation of powers, Locke's emphasis on protecting individual liberties, it's all woven into the fabric of the Constitution.
Absolutely. The framers of the Constitution were deeply influenced by Enlightenment thought. They sought to create a system that would prevent tyranny and protect the freedoms they had fought so hard to win. They didn't want to simply replace one form of tyranny with another. They wanted to create a government that truly served the people, not the other way around.
And that's where the Bill of Rights comes in, right? Those first 10 amendments to the Constitution that explicitly guarantee fundamental rights, such as freedom of speech, religion, and the press.
Precisely. The Bill of Rights was a crucial addition to the Constitution. It ensured that individual liberties would be protected from government intrusion. Take, for example, the First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of speech. This right, inspired by Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, was seen as essential to a free and open society. It allowed for dissenting voices to be heard and for the open exchange of ideas, which the framers believed was essential for a healthy democracy.
But freedom of speech, even back then, must have been a complex so. Where do you draw the line? How do you balance individual rights with the need for order and security?
These debates still rage on today, don't they?
They absolutely do, and that's what makes the Bill of Rights so fascinating. It's a living document open to interpretation and debate. The framers knew that they couldn't foresee every possible situation, so they left room for future generations to grapple with these fundamental questions. It's incredible to see how these Enlightenment ideas, born out of philosophical salons and coffee houses, actually shaped the course of history. It's like a chain reaction, with each event leading to the next. But the story doesn't end with the American Revolution, does it? Across the Atlantic, another revolution was brewing, also inspired by Enlightenment ideals.
You're right. While the American Revolution was unfolding, another revolution fueled by many of the same Enlightenment ideals was brewing across the Atlantic. The French Revolution, which erupted in 1789, sought to overthrow the absolute monarchy and establish a more just and equitable society.
So the American Revolution wasn't just an isolated event. It was part of a larger wave of change sweeping across the world. It's almost as if the ideas of the Enlightenment were a virus, spreading from one nation to the next, infecting the minds of revolutionaries and reformers.
That's a striking analogy. And just like the American Declaration of Independence, the French Revolution produced its own iconic document, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, adopted in 1789. It echoed many of the same principles found in the American Declaration. It proclaimed the natural rights of man, emphasized equality before the law, and asserted the sovereignty of the people.
It sounds like the American and French revolutions were two sides of the same coin, both inspired by Enlightenment ideas, both seeking to overthrow oppressive systems, but perhaps with different visions for what a just society should look like. What were some of the key differences between the two revolutions? Did the French take a more radical approach?
That's a perceptive observation. The French Revolution from the outset was much more about a radical transformation of society itself. They weren't just seeking to replace a king, they wanted to dismantle the entire social hierarchy, to abolish feudalism, and to create a society where all citizens were truly equal. It was a much more ambitious and ultimately more chaotic and violent revolution.
So it's not just about who's in charge, but how society itself is structured. That adds another layer of complexity to the French Revolution, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And while both revolutions drew inspiration from the Enlightenment, they also highlight the diverse ways in which these ideas could be interpreted and applied. The American Revolution, with its focus on individual liberty and limited government, ultimately led to a relatively stable democratic republic. The French Revolution, on the other hand, with its more radical ambitions, descended into chaos and violence before eventually giving way to a new form of authoritarianism under Napoleon.
It's a reminder that revolutions, even those guided by noble ideals, can have unintended consequences. It's a delicate balancing act, isn't it?
Yeah.
Striving for progress and change, while also preserving stability and order.
It's a perennial challenge, one that societies continue to grapple with today. And as we reflect on the American Revolution and its Enlightenment roots, it's worth considering how these ideas continue to shape our world, both for better and for worse.
It's a reminder that revolutions, even those guided by noble ideals, can have unintended consequences. It's a delicate balancing act, isn't it? Striving for progress and change, while also preserving stability and order.
It's a perennial challenge, one that societies continue to grapple with today.
Yeah.
And as we reflect on the American Revolution and its Enlightenment roots, it's worth considering how these ideas continue to shape our world, both for better and for worse.
It's fascinating how those two revolutions, both sparked by Enlightenment ideals, took such different paths. The American Revolution led to a relatively stable democracy, while the French Revolution spiraled into chaos and violence. It makes you wonder, were there any specific events or decisions that pushed the French Revolution down a darker path?
Well, the French Revolution faced a multitude of challenges: a severe economic crisis, deep social inequalities, and a powerful, entrenched aristocracy resistant to change. These factors created a volatile environment ripe for radicalism and violence. The storming of the Bastille in 1789, often seen as the symbolic start of the revolution, unleashed a torrent of popular anger and resentment. That proved difficult to control.
I've heard about the Reign of Terror, a period of extreme violence and executions during the French Revolution. Was that a direct result of this volatile mix of social and economic turmoil?
The Reign of Terror from 1793 to 1794 was a dark chapter in the French Revolution. It was a period of extreme paranoia and political repression, fueled by fear of counter-revolution and external threats. The guillotine, initially intended as a more humane method of execution, became a symbol of terror, used to eliminate perceived enemies of the revolution. Thousands of people, including the king and queen, were sent to the guillotine during this period.
It's chilling to think about how an invention like the guillotine, designed with good intentions, could be twisted into an instrument of terror. It seems to highlight the dangers of unchecked power, even in a revolution that began with ideals of liberty and equality.
Exactly. The Reign of Terror serves as a stark reminder that even revolutions rooted in noble ideals can go terribly wrong. It's a cautionary tale about the fragility of democracy and the importance of safeguarding individual rights, even amidst turbulent times.
It's incredible to see how these Enlightenment ideas, born out of philosophical salons and coffee houses, actually shaped the course of history. We started with a tax on tea and ended up exploring revolutions, constitutions, and even a gruesome invention like the guillotine. Who knew that the Enlightenment could be so action-packed?
History is full of surprises, isn't it? And often the most significant events are driven by ideas that challenge the status quo and inspire people to imagine a different future.
I think the key takeaway for me is that ideas matter. They have the power to shape not just our thoughts, but the course of history itself.
That's a powerful insight. And as you continue to explore the world around you, I encourage you to keep asking questions, to challenge assumptions, and to never underestimate the power of ideas to change the world. Considering how much the world has changed since the American Revolution, do the principles of the Enlightenment still hold relevance today?
Well, that's the question we all need to ponder. We've come a long way since the days of powdered wigs and quill pens. But have we truly progressed in terms of upholding those core values of reason, individual rights, and limited government? As we navigate the complexities of the 21st century, the legacy of the Enlightenment, both its triumphs and its failures, offers valuable lessons for us all. Thanks for guiding us through this deep dive. It's given me a whole new perspective on the American Revolution and the enduring legacy of the Enlightenment.
It's been my pleasure. Remember, history is not just a collection of dates and names. It's a tapestry of interconnected events and ideas that continue to shape our present and influence our future. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.